Okay, A pushers. So today we're going to talk about the Indian Wars that take place on mostly the American frontier from 1864 to 1890. Our years here. Now, we have been certainly fighting, having a number of conflicts with American Indians almost from the time that the first Europeans show up here, right? If you think back to the Spanish and the Encomida in the American Southwest, and then the English show up, and the English really don't have any interest in converting the Indians to Christianity. They just kind of want them out of the way. And so there's all these conflicts. But it really ramps up for the United States between the years of 1864, right at the end of the Civil War, and 1890. All right, so here's what's happening. Right after the Civil War, Western expansion kind of kicks into high gear again. Now, we've always been pushing further and further west, right? The British didn't want us to go over the Appalachian Mountains. With the proclamation of 1763, and then we pushed to the Mississippi, and then we got beyond the Mississippi, and we've always been kind of very interested in pushing further and further west. During the Civil War, that kind of slows down, and for obvious reasons, we're in a war. After the Civil War, there's this renewed interest and renewed push further west. Now, as they continue to go west, settlers are going out there. Railroads are beginning to follow the settlers out there. So more and more land is being gobbled up. As this is happening, of course, this leads to more conflicts with Native Americans who happen to be living out there. They're not real thrilled with all of these settlers and railroads and everything coming through their hunting land. And the settlers and railroads are not real thrilled with the American Indians being there. So this leads to the Indian Wars between 1864 and 1890. Now, a couple of reasons why this happens. Okay. First off, the settlers and the American government really sees the Indians as like a speed bump to American expansion. So they've got to get them out of the way. They're slowing down Western expansion. Another reason why this is happening is soldiers who became officers during the Civil War want to keep their rank and stay in the military, right? It's a pretty good salary. It's a fairly good life as an officer during the Civil War. Right after the Civil War, there is a economic recession that takes place. So jobs are hard to come by. Money is hard to come by. And also after the Civil War, we really don't have a need for a very large standing army. So they begin to reduce the size of the army and begin to release soldiers to go back home. Well, a lot of these soldiers like being an officer. They like the pay. They like the life. So they've got to find a reason. They've got to come up with a reason to justify their jobs. And a way to justify their jobs is to go fight the Indians in the West. Then maybe the biggest reason is there's just a massive misunderstanding between settlers and Indians. They just don't get each other. They just don't understand each other. For instance, in most Indian cultures, American Indian cultures, they don't have a concept of ownership. They just don't understand. They don't have a meaning or a concept of ownership. They don't know what it means to own something. You can't own land. You can't own property. It's just a very foreign idea to them. Whereas certainly with the settlers, they've got this concept of ownership. And in American culture, American Indian cultures, one of the ways that you could elevate your status within your tribe was to go to a competing tribe and take some horses that they have, or round up some cattle that they may have, and bring that back to your tribe. And if you can do that, then that elevates your status within the tribe. And the tribe that lost their horses in this, now they see this as a challenge, and they're going to go back to the other tribe and try to get their horses back and maybe get some more back, right? But they don't understand, they don't have a concept of ownership, so they don't have a concept of stealing. When the settlers begin to move out, certainly they have a concept of ownership. And when things like this happen, they see the Indians as stealing, and the Indians really don't understand what it is that they're talking about. They don't have any concept of ownership, so they have no concept of stealing. For the settlers, this is a big problem. For the Indians, it will become a big problem because they begin to get shot and killed. So that's part of the big misunderstanding that happens between settlers and American Indians. During this 25-year time frame, there's going to be a number of battles huge battles that take place on the plains. And there's even more just minor skirmishes where they kind of run into each other out on the plains, and they exchange some gunfire, and there's a small fight, and then it's over. Okay. Now, many of these battles are very bloody, very brutal, and they've become a major part of American history. One of the most famous battles that take place during this time, one of the most famous American Indian battles that takes place, happens right here in Colorado. It's called the Sand Creek Massacre. Now, full disclosure, I am an American exceptionalist. I believe that America is a pretty exceptional place. I think America is a very special place. And there's a lot of things I think to be proud of in American history. However, it certainly doesn't mean that we haven't done some very bad things. We've done some very reprehensible things, and we've done some awful things. This battle that's going to happen, the Sand Creek Massacre, is one of the most horrific, one of the most disgusting, one of the most unforgivable things that's ever happened in American history. And it happened here in Colorado. So here's what's happening. In Colorado, we're not a state yet. We're a territory, the territory of Colorado. Throughout the summer of 1864, there had been a number of conflicts, skirmishes that had been taking place mostly out on the eastern plains between Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians. Those were the two main Indian groups here in Colorado, in northeastern Colorado. So Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians and settlers, there have been these increasing conflicts and skirmishes taking place throughout the summer of 1864. June 11th of 1864, Ward Huntgate and his family, who live just kind of southeast of Denver, if you kind of know where Elizabeth, Colorado is, kind of out in that area. Ward Huntgate and his family are killed by what will appear to be Arapaho Indians. There's evidence that indicates that the Arapaho Indians were to blame for this. Now, Ward Huntgate had a ranch out there, and he was out running some fence. He was putting in a new fence on his property, and he happened to look back over a hill, and he noticed some smoke rising up from on the other side of the hill. Well, on the other side of the hill is where his house was. So Ward Huntgate told his farmhand, his ranch hand, the guy who was helping him, he said, "You got to go back to Denver and get help. Something's wrong. I'm going to go over the hill and see what happened." And that's the last time Ward Huntgate was seen alive. When help arrives from Denver, the ranch hand does ride back to Denver and then gets help, and they have to ride back out to the Huntgate ranch. This is a couple of days now. When they get out there, they find that all of the members of the Huntgate family, there was Ward Huntgate, he had 3 sons, I think he had 2 daughters and his wife. All of them had been killed. The boys, Ward Huntgate and his sons, they had been scalped. His wife and daughters, they had been scalped, but they had also been sexually assaulted. They had been raped, brutally and savagely raped when they got there. So The bodies are then brought back to Denver in a very weird thing that happened out on the western frontier. They would put bodies on display in the local bar, and they would charge people to come through and view the bodies. And very often they would do this with criminals as a warning to other criminals: don't mess around here, this is what happens. In this case, they're putting their bodies on display to show what these wild savages out on the eastern plains had done to this God-fearing family. So tensions begin to rise, of course, because of this. And there's pictures of the family, and there's stories in the local newspaper at that time. And so this only increases tensions between settlers who swore revenge for the massacre of this God-fearing Christian family out on the eastern plains of Colorado, and Native Americans who really, for the most part, just kind of wanted to be left alone. So tensions begin to swell as we move through late summer into the fall. And then come these characters. Black Kettle, who is the main leader of the Cheyenne, a very, very well-respected leader of the Cheyenne. The territorial governor of that time, his name is John Evans. And then Bent's Fort, which is a tiny military fort out on the eastern plains of Colorado. You can go there and see it today. It's right outside of, I think, Lamar, Colorado. So in October of 1864, Black Kettle is very worried about the conflicts that are taking place on the plains. The late fall into the winter is when these normally nomadic tribes kind of settle down and they camp out in one place for the winter, because it's very hard to move around, obviously, during the winter. So Cheyenne, the Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle, is very worried about the fights and the skirmishes that have been taking place throughout the summer into the fall of 1864. And he's very worried that as they begin to settle down for the winter, they will kind of become sitting ducks, that it'll be easy for the Indians to be attacked and killed by these settlers. So Black Kettle goes and he visits with Governor John Evans. Now, John Evans certainly knows Black Kettle. Black Kettle is a very well-respected Indian chief. He had been to Washington, D.C. He met what they called the Great White Father, President Lincoln. That was the term that American Indians had for the President of the United States, the Great White Father. And he had received a medal from Lincoln saying that he was a peaceful, good Indian. He should be treated with respect. So Black Kettle goes to John Evans and he tells him, look, we've got a bed down for the winter, but we want to go somewhere safe that we can be protected and not be attacked. And traveling with Black Kettle's tribe were also a number of Arapaho Indians who had kind of latched on, who were also very friendly and peaceful with the American government. So John Evans says, well, look, you can't stay in Denver. There's nowhere really around Denver that's safe for you to stay. He said, but you know where Bent's Fort is, out on the eastern plains. He said, I'm going to give you a letter. You go out to Bent's Fort, you show the commander at Bent's Fort this letter, and he'll give you somewhere to stay. So Black Kettle and his Cheyenne and Arapaho begin making their way out to Bent's Fort. When they get to Bent's Fort, the Bent's Fort is a very, very small military fort. There's really not a lot of room if you've ever been there. The commander at Bent's Fort says, well, I don't have anywhere for you guys to stay here. I barely have enough room for the soldiers. And you really can't stay outside of the walls of the fort because there's so much traffic coming in and out all the time. He said, but I'll tell you what I'll do. You know where Sand Creek is, which is not too far away from where Bent's Fort is. He said, go to Sand Creek and bed down on the banks of Sand Creek there for the winter. He said, I will give you an American flag to fly above your village. and that will keep you safe, right? The American flag was like this universal symbol. If it flew over an Indian encampment, it meant that this tribe of Indians were peaceful, friendly Indians with the American government, and they were protected by the United States government. So he gave them this flag to fly above their village. So Black Kettle and his Indians make their way out to Sand Creek to bed down for the winter. Now, meanwhile, there's a new preacher that's arrived in Denver. His name is John Chivington. He was an officer during the Civil War for the Union. He comes from Ohio, and he's fresh off the battlefields, and he's now come to Denver to set up a new Methodist church. Now, there's one thing that John Chivington hates more than slavery, and he hated slavery as an abomination against God. The only thing he hates worse than slavery are Indians. To John Chivington, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And John Chivington believes that he can do whatever he wants to do to get rid of the Indians. Killing the Indians is not an issue for John Chivington because God is on his side. It's tough to beat God, you know. So John Chivington has arrived in Denver just after the Huntgate massacre has taken place. And he's outraged. We've got to go get these Indians and we've got to teach them a lesson. So he goes to John Evans and he says, I want you to give me a military commission for the Colorado Territory. I want you to give me a military unit so I can go out and hunt down these Indians who caused this problem. No, Evans agrees. We've got to bring these Indians who murdered this wonderful Huntgate family. We've got to bring them to justice. So John Evans creates a military unit, the 3rd Regiment of Colorado Volunteers. It's a volunteer military unit, meaning they're not going to draft people. They're not going to bring in regular military soldiers from the United States military or the Colorado militia. These are going to be people that John Chivington recruits to be part of his military unit to go out and hunt the Indians. Now, John Chivington, you can see the flyer that's posted up there. You can see it down there in the corner. That's posted all over Denver. Okay. And in Denver at this time, you know, it's mostly young men who are in Denver. They're railroad workers, they're miners, they're cowboys. And he goes, you want some adventure? Are you looking to do something exciting? Come with me and let's go hunt some Indians. And pretty soon he's got a pretty big group of people who are willing to join the 3rd Regiment of Colorado Volunteers and go out and find these Indians. They hang around in Denver for a few days and they go, well, there's not any Indians here. Guess we're going to have to go look for them. So in October of 1864, Chivington leads the military unit out of Denver into the plains looking for Indians. Around November 27th, 1864, Chivington and his army arrive in Bent's Fort. And they start asking the soldiers, have you seen any Indians? Are there any Indians around here? Can you tell me where some Indians are? And they eventually find out that Black Kettle and his tribe had recently come through Bent's Fort and were now camped along the banks of Sand Creek. Oh boy. This is not going to go well. November 29th, just as dawn broke over the village, Chivington and his men come riding down the hillside into the village. Now, most of the men in the village are gone. In the village is mostly women, children, and old men. That's all that's there. Most of the men are gone out hunting to get enough food to last them through the winter. Black Kettle immediately runs to the flagpole as he sees um, the cavalry come running into the village. He thinks, "Oh, they must not have seen the American flag," and he pulls the American flag down and he begins running towards towards the soldiers, waving the American flag over his head to show that they are a friendly, peaceful tribe that are protected by the United States government. Black Kettle is shot in the hip. As the cavalry rides through the village, shooting at anything and everything that moves, an Arapaho Indian chief by the name of White Antelope comes out and he sees what's going on and he sits down beside his teepee and he begins to chant, "Today is a good day to die. Today is a good day to die." As he's sitting there chanting, a soldier rides by on his horse and stops, and he leans down and puts the barrel of his rifle against White Antelope's head and pulls the trigger. Over the course of the next few hours, over 200 Indians are brutally massacred. Soldiers were getting off of their horses and kneeling down and taking target practice at the children as they ran through the teepees. Women, very young women, all the way up to very old women, were brutally and savagely raped. Their bodies were mutilated. The young boys in the village had their bodies mutilated in various ways. It was just complete hell on earth for the Indians at Sand Creek. John Chivington arrives back in Denver to a hero's welcome. And these are some of the images that survivors from Sand Creek drew of the attack that took place. Now, the story's not done. Soon afterward, word begins to get out about what happened. Some of the soldiers, some of the volunteers, there's some regular army that were also along with John Chivington to help him with his military endeavors, begin to talk, and word gets out of what actually happened. John Chivington is brought up on crimes against humanity and other various war crimes. Now, if he's found guilty of these crimes, John Chivington will be executed. As Chivington's court date approached, all these people who were going to testify against John Chivington suddenly got amnesia. They just couldn't remember exactly what happened. And so they're going to stop. They refuse to testify because they just really can't be sure about what happened. Except for one. He was a regular soldier. He was a regular army soldier. And his name was Silas Sewell. You see his picture there. And he refused to participate in the massacre because he saw the American flag above the village. And he believed that it was wrong, it was immoral, and he would not participate in this because they had the American flag flying above their village. And he chose to remain on the hillside and watch the carnage take place. Silas Sewell was determined to testify. He was not going to forget, no matter how many times he was visited by various people telling him, I don't think you really remember what happened. Night before the trial was to open, Silas Sewell was in Denver, and he was crossing Larimer Street in downtown Denver. He had just finished dinner, and he was leaving the restaurant where he had eaten. He was walking across the street to go back to where he was staying. As he was crossing Larimer Street, a shot rang out from an alleyway, striking Silas Sewell in the head and killing him instantly. All charges against John Chivington were dropped. Oof. Now, it doesn't end there. To this day, still today, the closest town to the site of the Sand Creek Massacre is called Chivington, Colorado. There's Sand Creek, which is now a National Historic Site. And the town closest to it that you turn off of to go to is called Chivington, Colorado. And there's a picture of a marker at the site of the massacre. Oof. So that's Sand Creek. Now, certainly there is a high point for the American Indians in the Indian Wars, and it comes against this guy, George Armstrong Custer. It comes on June 25th, 1876. So here's what happened. The U.S. cavalry has been sent into the Montana Dakotas area to force Indians back onto the reservations. Gold has been found in the region. So now it's very interesting for settlers and speculators and railroads. So they're trying to push all of the Indians onto these reservations, which are tracts of land that the government has set aside for the Indians to live. Now, usually these tracts of land are on horrifically bad pieces of land that nobody wants. So we're going to give it to the Indians. If you remember back to the Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson, they create the Indian Territory, and it's present day Oklahoma, and they gave it to the Indians because, I mean, my goodness, would anybody in their right mind want to live here? So Colonel George Armstrong Custer is in charge of a cavalry unit to try to push the Indians in the Montana Dakota region back onto reservations so settlers and companies and railroads can come in and begin mining the gold. On June 25th, 1876, the 7th Cavalry, led by Custer, are led into an ambush. The Lakota Indians set up clues to show that there is a tribe of Indians who are moving. They have, burned out campsites and stuff, leading George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry to believe that they're trailing some Lakota Indians, and they're going to eventually track them down and push them onto the reservation. They're being led into a trap. As they go into this area known as Little Bighorn, it's what's known as a box canyon. Okay, it's meaning that there are hills, very tall hills, on 3 sides. There's one way in and there's one way out, and it's the same way. As they go into this box canyon, Little Bighorn, appearing on the edges of the hillside are hundreds of Lakota Indians who open fire on the 7th Cavalry. They've basically got them trapped, and they come thundering down the hillside. Right, there's all this shooting. At the end of this battle, it's not even a battle, it's just really a massacre. Every single soldier in the 7th Cavalry, including their horses, are killed. 263 soldiers. 60 Indians are killed. The government swears revenge. They're going to make the Indians pay for this. So there's a very stylized artist view of what happened at Little Bighorn. You can see in the middle there's George Armstrong Custer standing up, shooting his pistols, and the soldiers have created a ring to fight off the Indians, and they look very gallant, and they look very brave, and they look very, you know, you're heroic. It's probably not the way it really went down. And here's the battlefield as it looks today. Little Bighorn, Greasy Grass. The Lakota Indians call the area Greasy Grass. They buried the soldiers as they were found, so they didn't move the bodies. As the government came in, they found these soldiers. They buried them exactly where they were found, and that's where the headstones. That's why the headstones are kind of all over the place there. So you can see the way they fell doesn't really look like what the painting is. So now the government's going to shut down the Indians for good. And it involves this, and it's a crazy, crazy story. So the American government really begins to focus on destroying the American Indian and force them onto reservations. And they begin to restrict their food and do all these things to kind of break the morale of the American Indians. And the Native Americans begin to lose hope during this time. And then comes the Messiah craze. Okay? Now, Messiah means the Savior. And every American Indian culture has some sort of Messiah story. The Messiah story in the late 1860s for most American cultures was that the Messiah was going to come. And as the Messiah came to the American Indians and to the frontier, all the white men would go and all the buffalo would return, and all of our ancestors from the happy hunting grounds would return as well. Now, around 1888, 1889, rumor begins to spread that the Messiah is here. The Messiah's arrived. Oh, how exciting is this? Now, to get the Messiah to actually come to the American Indians, we've got to show our love and our devotion to the Messiah. So if they can show their undying love and respect and admiration and belief in the Messiah, that'll quicken his arrival to the American Indians and drive all of these settlers and all of the white men out of the plains. So in order to do this, the American Indians, particularly up in the northern parts, Montana, Dakotas area, they do what's known as a ghost dance. It's a ritualistic dance that the American Indians had. And during the ghost dance, they would wear these special magical shirts called ghost shirts. Now, the ghost shirts, oh, that's what you see there. That's a picture. The ghost shirts, oh, they're magical. True story. They can stop bullets. Mm-hmm. When the Native American is wearing a ghost shirt, and white soldiers or white settlers shoot at the Indians, their bullets will bounce off the ghost shirts. Ooh, well, that's special. So now the American Indians have hope. They have pride again. They have a reason to live again. And the ghost dance is beginning to spread like wildfire throughout the frontier. Well, this scares the bejesus out of the government. So the government outlaws the ghost dance. Can't do it anymore. So a large group of Lakota Indians leave the reservation where the government has a lot of control. The government has the ability to completely shut down and get rid of the ghost dance. Large group of Lakota Indians kind of escape from the reservation and begin wandering around Montana and the Dakotas area so they can do the ghost dance to bring the Messiah. On December 28, 1890, These Lakota are finally captured, tracked down and captured by the American Army, and they're taken to the nearest reservation, which is called Wounded Knee. And the government's going to keep them there. The Army is going to keep them there until the next day when they will be sent to a military prison in Oklahoma, or in Nebraska, I'm sorry. Now, when they get to Wounded Knee, the Lakota are told, you got to give up all your weapons. Okay? Just throw them in a pile here, give up all your weapons. The next day, the government, the military pulls all the Indians out, and they have them all standing in kind of a canyon, kind of. They're down on the floor of this low point in Wounded Knee, and up on the hillside surrounding them are soldiers. And the soldiers say, we went through all the weapons that you guys gave up yesterday, and there's not enough. So somebody's holding out. Some of you guys are still holding on to weapons. We're going to get them. And the soldiers begin going from Indian to Indian to Indian, searching them to get their rifles. They find one Indian who is hiding a rifle under his blanket, and a struggle begins to take place between the soldier and the Indian, back and forth, back and forth. Give me your gun. I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. And they're circling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with the rifle. In the middle of all this, some of the other Indians begin doing the ghost dance. So you have these soldiers fighting with this one Indian to get his rifle, and all of a sudden all these other Indians around you begin doing the ghost dance. It's a very bizarre scene. In the middle of this struggle for the rifle goes off. The soldiers who were up on the hillsides with their guns pointing at the Indians believe they've just been shot at. So they open fire on the Lakota. Oh boy. Lakota go, don't worry, we've got ghost shirts. And they begin putting on their ghost shirts, right? The bullets are going to bounce off. Guess what? They don't work. Oh, great googly moogly. At the end of all this, over 300 American Indians are killed. Oh boy. Now, whole new problem. The weather is beginning to turn, and there's a blizzard that blows in. They haven't done anything with the bodies. They've got all 300 Lakota Indians lying dead in this field. And the soldiers go, well, it's no fun digging graves and putting these bodies in the grave in the cold and snow. It's okay. We'll do it when we come back, right? They're still going to be there after, when the blizzard has passed. So after the blizzard and things have kind of settled down, the army comes back to bury the dead. Big problem. Their bodies are frozen to the ground. So as they try to move the Indians off of the ground into the graves, body parts begin to snap off. Oh, there's a leg. Snap! There's an arm, because the bodies are frozen solid. Oh boy. At this point, the Native Americans have come to this realization after Wounded Knee that they're never going to win. The government has all of the power. They've got all of the weapons. They've got all of the money. We can never win. And so after 200 years of fighting against settlers moving into their land, the American Indians have basically resigned themselves at this point. It's just not going to happen. And the Indian Wars, for the most part, pretty much stop at that point, certainly in the form that they had been taking place. They're no longer these armed resistances that take place. At this point, the government changes its policy from kill the Indian to kill their culture, which in some ways is even worse than just killing the Indian themselves. Here are some pictures of the bodies at Wounded Knee. And there's a picture of the soldiers finally burying the Indians, that they've been able to dig this large mass grave. All right, so now we're going to kill our culture. The belief among the American government at that time was, in order to get rid of Indian culture, you have to teach it out of them. You have to get a hold of the young and teach them not to be Indians. And if you can get the young and teach them not to be Indians, then the young are going to grow up and they'll have their children and they'll pass that on to their children. And eventually we'll get rid of the Indian culture. Okay? So what happened was Native American children were literally kidnapped off of reservations and put into a boarding school. They wanted to get them as far away from the reservation as possible, right? The reservation is where it was all about being an Indian. Get them off the reservation and put them somewhere where they're completely out of the Native American environment, and teach them how to not be an Indian. And so they had literally, right? No American Indian was going to willingly give up their children, go, yeah, I think this is a good idea. Nobody was going to do that. So the children literally were kidnapped from the reservations and sent off to these boarding schools to teach the Indian out of them. Now, it was a former Army officer. His name was Richard Pratt, who was very involved in the Indian Wars at first. And initially, he did not like the Indians. He believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. But over time, he really came to appreciate the Indians and really felt like he was doing them a solid, like he was really helping them out by doing this. He really believed teaching them to not be Indians would be in their best interest. And so he opens up the first school for these boarding schools. It's an old Army base called the Carlisle School. It's still around today, and it's still a Native American school still today. So here's what would happen. As soon as these kids showed up after being kidnapped, or as soon as they got off the train, they would take a picture of them. Okay? And then once they felt like they had taught the Indian out of them, they would take a picture of them afterwards to show the progress, right? It's like the weight loss photos when you see in the newspaper, right? Here was Shirley when she was 750 pounds. And now, after being on our diet, look at her. She's 110, right? That kind of stuff. So they would take these before and after pictures and they would put them in magazines and newspapers to show this great work that they were doing and encourage people to donate to the Indian schools to continue this education. Okay. So here's what your school day looked like if we're going to make them less Indian. In the morning, they're going to learn they're going to learn English, how to read it, how to write it, how to speak it, and they're going to learn Christianity. That's how they're going to become, quote unquote, American. And the textbook was the Bible. They can do everything with one textbook. They can learn how to read, they can learn how to write, and they can learn how to speak English reading the Bible. And at the same time, they'll learn about Christianity. In the afternoon, they split it up by gender. Boys would learn how to farm and basic building skills, raising a barn and things like that. And then girls would learn how to cook and how to clean and how to sew and how to take care of children. And that's how they taught the Indian out of them. Okay. For the most part, this program is a complete and total failure, because here's what happens. Once they had been un-Indianized, they might go live in Well, the hope was that they would go back to the reservation and teach their skills, their newfound education and their newfound skills about how not to be an Indian. And they would teach it on the reservations and it would spread throughout the reservations. Well, what happened when they got back to the reservations, the other Indians saw them as kind of sellouts, right? You can walk like him and you can talk like him, but you ain't never going to be like the white man. And you sold out your people. And they became very ostracized, outcasts on the reservation. So then many of them would try to then go to the cities and live in the cities and in these frontier communities, but they wouldn't be accepted there because even though they may act like quote unquote American, and they may talk like an American, and they may dress like an American, it doesn't change their color. They're never going to be white. And so they were never accepted there. So what happens with this generation of kids that have this done to them? They become a person without a people. They don't belong anywhere because nobody will accept them. And so what many of them do is they go back to their old Native American ways because they can't change their physical features, but they can change the way they live. And so all this effort is put into this program, and really, for the most part, it's a failure. So then comes the government. The United States government comes in and says, gosh, we've got to figure out what the American Indians want. Oh, I know what they want. I know how to civilize and how to Americanize the Native Americans. And we passed this law called the Dawes Act. Okay, and the Dawes Act, the goal of the Dawes Act, these people, and bless their hearts. I mean, they're really trying. They really think this is for the best. Mm-hmm. They believe, this group of reformers who get this law passed, they believe that really what the American Indians want is to be a citizen of the United States. So they come up with this law called the Dawes Act. So here's what they're going to do. They're going to go to the reservations, and they're going to divide up the reservations into 160-acre plots of land. Okay? And then each head of the household will get a plot of land, and it'll be theirs to live on. And if they could make it useful, meaning that they build a permanent structure and they grow some food, they do some stuff with this land to make it useful, and they live there for 25 years, they're going to become a citizen and they get their own plot of land. Yay! Now, after they've divided up all the land on the reservations and all the land has been given out to the heads of households, if there was any land that was left over after that on the reservations, well, we're going to sell that off to settlers and open up more land for settlement. Okay. If the Native American left this plot of land before their 25 years is up, then the land went back to the federal government, who would then sell the land. And you can see the picture there. It's an advertisement to go buy what used to be Indian land, right? Now, most of these Indians are nomadic. Okay. So they're used to moving around all the time. That's just their lifestyle. Well, now they're restricted to 160-acre plots that they can't leave. So what many Indians begin to do is they just begin to move periodically around their 160 acres of land, right? If they can't just move at free will all over the reservation like they used to, they'll just go 160 acres. And a lot of this land is not very good farming land, so they really couldn't make it useful. Most of these farmers are not farmers because they're nomadic, so they move all the time, so they never really grew their own food. So they don't have any experience with that. So many of these Indians just leave the land because they don't really get this concept of we're going to own this land after living here for 25 years. They can't make the land useful. They're starving. There's not any buffalo roaming across their 160 acres. So many of them just left their land, which meant that the land went back to the government, who then could sell it. So here's the outcome of the Dawes Act. In 1887, Native Americans lived on 138 million acres of land. By 1944, it lost 2/3 of that land. 48 million acres of land was all of the land that Native Americans had by 1944. Woof. Over the course of 50 years, because of the way the Dawes Act was written, American Indians lose 2/3 of their land. Oh boy. So, here comes one of my all-time favorite stories. This is a great story. The last one, by the time we get to 1900, there are really no more quote unquote wild Indians out in the West. They've all been put on reservations or they live in cities or whatever. On August 29th, 1911, the last wild Indian pops up in a barn in San Francisco. And it's this very, obviously a very sick, naked Indian that this farmer finds in his barn. And he gets in touch with the San Francisco police. San Francisco police come and say, oh, that sure is a naked Indian. And they don't know what to do with him. So they arrest him and they put him in jail. They don't know what to do with him. Okay. In San Francisco at that time happened to be a carnival. And the owner of the carnival happened to be reading the newspaper. And he read about this Indian. And he goes and bails this Indian out of jail. And he puts him into his traveling carnival as a sideshow attraction, with the bearded lady and the yak woman and, the guy with 5 arms and all that. He's going to be part of the freak show. And he was billed as the last wild American Indian. And people would pay 5 cents to come in and they would look at this Indian sitting in a cage on a stool looking back at these carnival goers. Now, in 1912, the carnival comes back through San Francisco. And there's a Stanford anthropologist whose specialty is American Indians, studying American Indians. His name is Alfred Kroeber. And he sees an advertisement for this last wild American Indian at this carnival. So Alfred Kroeber goes to the carnival, pays his 5 cents. He sees the Indian sitting in this cage on a stool, staring at him as Alfred Kroeber stares back at this Indian. And Alfred Kroeber thinks, I can't let this guy live like this. So Alfred Kroeber goes to the owner of the carnival and he buys the Indian from him, pays him so he can take the Indian. And he takes this Indian back to Stanford University with him to study. And Kroeber brings in a linguist friend of his. Now, a linguist is somebody who studies languages and they figure out how languages operate and they can decode languages and so on and so forth. So he brings in this linguist who specializes in Native American languages. And this linguist begins to talk and work with this Indian and learn some of this Indian's language. And then he can then teach it to Alfred Kroeber. And then this linguist then teaches English to this American Indian. So this American Indian now has some English. And now Alfred Kroeber and this Indian can now begin to talk with each other. And here's what they find out. This Indian's name is Ishi. And Ishi was the last surviving member of a very, very small American Indian tribe that lived in the mountains above San Francisco called the Yahi. And they'd always been a very small tribe, and they were hunters and gatherers that lived in the mountains above San Francisco, the Yahi. When the gold rush takes place in San Francisco in 1859, or 1849, I'm sorry, and all these settlers came in and they began to spread out into the mountains looking for gold, they began to kill off the Yahi that were up in the mountains there. And eventually, it's just Ishi, his mother, and this other guy who survive. And they live in a cave away from the hiding away from these prospectors and these settlers. Eventually, Ishi's mother dies, and then it's just Ishi and this other guy. And then, near as they could tell, this other guy died about 15 years. Late 1800s, he died. And so Ishi was just by himself, and he was terrified. And he would only come out at night to get food, and then he would scurry back into his cave. And he could definitely see the lights of San Francisco. He knew that there were people down there, but he was terrified of them because of what had happened to his tribe. In 1911, he got very, very, very sick, and he knew he was going to die. And he thought, if I went into San Francisco, that might be my only shot at living. I might die by going into San Francisco, but I'm certainly going to die in this cave. And that's how he ends up in San Francisco, and how he ended up in jail and in the carnival and so on and so forth. Ishi and Kroeber become very, very good, very close friends. And Ishi would often take Alfred Kroeber basically on camping trips up into his old home site and would show Kroeber his traditional ways of life that Kroeber was enormously interested in, because he had never, nobody had ever really done an anthropological study on quote unquote wild Indians in their natural habitat. And so he was very interested in doing this. And he even took Alfred Kroeber to his burial, his ceremonial burial plot, which would, he was the only one who knew where that was. And Alfred Kroeber set Ishi up in a place on campus at Stanford University. And Ishi lived at Stanford, and all of his meals are provided. He had a very nice place at Stanford. Kroeber would take him into the city, and Ishi was fascinated by the city with the trolleys and the carriages and the hustle and bustle in the buildings. And Ishi was fascinated by this life as well. On August 11th, 1917, Alfred Kroeber was in Chicago giving a presentation. He was at an anthropological conference in Chicago, and he was giving a presentation on Ishi. And Ishi died while he was away. He got sick and died. And Ishi had asked Alfred Kroeber, he said, when I die, you have to leave my body intact. You can't take anything out of my body. You can't remove anything from my body. He said, otherwise, I can't go to the happy hunting ground. That was their belief. If your body was not intact, they couldn't go to heaven. He said, so when I die, you've got to promise me that my body will be left alone and that you will take me back to my burial ground so I can be buried with my people and I can go to the happy hunting ground with my people. And Alfred Kroeber promised him that. So Alfred Kroeber gets the telegram that Ishi had died. He immediately gets on a train and goes back to Stanford. By the time he got back to Stanford, he had found out that for whatever reason, the other anthropologists and the scientists at Stanford had removed Ishi's brain. Oof. And they couldn't find it. They had misplaced Ishi's brain. Alfred Kroeber took Ishi's body up to the burial site and buried Ishi's body at the burial site without his brain. Fast forward. 1995. While cleaning out an old storage closet in Stanford, Ishi's brain was found. And his brain was then taken back up to that Yahi ancient burial site and buried alongside Ishi's body. And that's the story of the last wild Indian. And that's the end of our notes on the Indian Wars in American history, 1864 to 1890. All right, we'll talk to you guys later. Take care.